An animal caught in a trap will gnaw off its own leg to escape. What will you do?
In an age before modern tools or power grids, survival wasn't about gear. It was about ingenuity. Medieval people didn't wait for rescue. They built what they needed with their own hands, using materials found in the wild and knowledge passed through generations. From fire-starting tools to hunting traps, these inventions weren't just clever, they were essential. And here's the twist. Most of them still work today. Whether you're a bushcraft enthusiast or just curious, these 7 tools prove that old world wisdom never went out of style. Shepherd's sling and slingshot traps. Centuries before rifles and revolvers, survival often came down to rope, leather, and a stone. The shepherd's sling was one of the oldest ranged weapons known to man. Simple, silent, and deadly in skilled hands, it wasn't a knight's weapon. It belonged to herders, travelers, and peasants living far from walls and watchtowers. With nothing more than braided cord and a leather pouch, they could turn smooth stones into airborne projectiles, capable of stunning birds, knocking out hares, or warding off predators. It was a tool of necessity, and it worked. Training with a sling was part of growing up in many rural regions. Boys practiced by hitting tree trunks, fence posts, or even moving targets like fruit thrown in the air. With time, their accuracy became impressive, sometimes lethal. The physics behind it were as elegant as they were effective. By spinning the sling, the thrower built up centrifugal force, then released one end at the perfect moment, sending the stone flying at speeds that could rival early crossbows. But the sling wasn't the only clever hunting tool in the medieval wild. Slingshot traps, known by various local names, were a favorite among peasants and forest dwellers. These primitive devices relied on tension and timing. A sapling was bent and held under strain, often with a snare or trigger mechanism made from string or vine. When an animal stepped into the wrong spot or disturbed the bait, the trap would snap upward, tightening the noose and lifting the prey from the ground. It was quiet, efficient, and reusable. These traps didn't require iron or craftsmanship. They just needed a sharp knife, patience, and a solid understanding of animal behavior. Hunters placed them near burrows, watering holes, or well-used trails. Sometimes they set dozens at once, checking them at dawn to collect whatever the forest had offered. And when paired with other passive traps, like deadfalls or pitfall pits, they became part of a low-tech but high-yield hunting system. What made both the sling and slingshot traps so valuable was their adaptability. Unlike heavy bows or metal traps, they were lightweight, easy to conceal, and fast to repair. If a sling wore out, you braided a new one. If a trap was triggered without a catch, you reset it in minutes. No blacksmith, no forge, just skill and local materials. Even today, these tools are seeing a quiet resurgence among bushcrafters, off-grid homesteaders, and survival instructors. Why? Because they teach something that's easy to forget in an age of gadgets and gear. Survival isn't about having the best tool. It's about knowing how to make the most with what you have. And in that sense, the medieval sling and trap are still doing what they've always done, feeding those who take the time to learn them. Tinderbox and Flint striker kits. Fire wasn't just something you made, it was something you carried. For medieval travelers, soldiers, and even villagers heading into the woods, the tinderbox was as essential as a blade or cloak. It was survival in your pocket, a way to start fire when the weather turned, when night fell, when everything was wet and there was no second chance. At its core, the tinderbox was simple, just a small metal or wooden container holding everything needed to spark flame. Inside, a piece of flint, a striker made of carbon steel, and most importantly, tinder. Not just any tinder, but cloth that had been charred in fire, usually linen or cotton, blackened but not burned, ready to catch the smallest ember and turn it into heat. Here's how it worked. You held the flint in one hand, the striker in the other, and struck them together at a sharp angle. Sparks flew, tiny, fleeting, but hot. When one landed on the char cloth, it smoldered, not a flame, but a glowing coal. That coal was then transferred to a nest of dry grass, bark shavings, or animal fur. A few steady breaths, a curl of smoke, then flame. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply satisfying. And it was repeatable. even in cold or damp conditions, if your materials were dry and your hands steady. Every medieval household had some version of this kit. Soldiers carried them in satchels. Travelers tied them to belts. Some were wrapped in leather, others packed in carved boxes, sealed against rain. It was one of the few tools that crossed every social class, from peasant huts to noble camps, because no one could afford to be without fire. More than just heat, fire was light. It was protection. It was a way to boil water, cook meat, sterilize wounds, dry clothing, and keep animals, or worse, at bay. In times of famine or war, knowing how to use a tinderbox meant you didn't have to rely on anyone else. And that kind of knowledge was power. Today, these kits are often recreated by survivalists and reenactors. Modern versions may include ferro rods or magnesium blocks, but the principle is unchanged. Spark plus tinder equals life. And in that glowing coal caught on blackened cloth, you're not just lighting a fire, you're holding history. Medieval bow drill, fire starter. Fire was everything. In the medieval world, it meant warmth, safety, cooked food, and sterilized water. But when the skies were wet and the wind howled through the trees, starting one without flint or matches was a different story. That's where the bow drill came in, an ancient, elegant solution to a fundamental problem: how to make fire from friction. The bow drill wasn't invented in the Middle Ages, but it was perfected by those who depended on it. Simple in design, profound in use, it consisted of 5 parts: the spindle, the hearthboard, the bearing block, a bit of tinder, and of course, the bow. None of it required metal, just dry wood, cordage, and hands that knew what they were doing. Here's how it worked. The spindle, a straight, finger-length stick, was pressed vertically onto the hearthboard, a flat piece of softer wood with a carved notch. The bow, strung tightly with cord, was wrapped around the spindle. One hand gripped the bow, the other pressed down on the spindle using a stone or bone-bearing block. Then came the rhythm, back and forth, back and forth. The bow turned the spindle. The spindle rubbed against the hearth. Smoke curled. Dust turned black. And if everything was done just right, if the speed was steady and the pressure firm, that blackened dust would catch, forming a tiny glowing ember, a flicker of heat, born from nothing more than wood and determination. But creating fire this way wasn't just about mechanics. It was about knowing your materials. Different woods created different results. Too hard, and they wouldn't generate enough friction. Too soft, and they'd crumble. Willow and elder were popular choices for the hearth. Hazel or spindlewood often served for the drill. Cordage came from animal sinew, twisted plant fibers, or even rawhide. Every part mattered. In medieval villages and outposts, the bow drill was often a last resort. Flint and steel were prized, but not always available, especially to the poor. So the bow drill was passed down like a family heirloom, not the tool itself, but the knowledge. Children learned it beside the fire they helped start. Travelers carried pieces of dry hearthboard wrapped in cloth, knowing that if the rains came, the right wood might be hard to find. Today, the bow drill is often treated like a novelty in survival courses. But in truth, it's one of the purest expressions of bushcraft, creating fire without chemicals, sparks, or shortcuts. It demands patience, awareness, and respect for the materials, and in return, it offers the one thing every survivalist needs most. Because once you have fire, everything else changes. A cold night becomes bearable, a raw meal becomes nourishing, and the fear that once crept in with the dark, it vanishes in the light of something you made with your own 2 hands. Folding wooden tripod, cooking plus smoking rack. Before cast iron stoves or steel grills, medieval people had to rely on tools that could be built, broken down, and rebuilt again, over fire, in the forest, or on the move. One of the simplest and most reliable among them was the folding wooden tripod. At first glance, it doesn't look like much, just 3 poles, some notches, and a length of cord. But with that, you get a versatile frame that could cook your food, boil your water, smoke your meat, and even dry your clothes, right in the heart of the wild. Building one was straightforward. 3 straight, sturdy branches, typically about shoulder height, were cut and trimmed. Each was notched or sharpened at one end and tied together at the top using strong cordage, vines, or strips of rawhide. When spread out, the tripod stood firmly over a fire, and from its center you could suspend anything. A clay pot, a metal kettle, a piece of meat, or even a woven basket of herbs or fish. But the tripod's magic wasn't just in cooking. It doubled as a smoking rack, an essential tool in a world without refrigeration. Once game was caught and cleaned, strips of meat were hung from crossbars laid over the tripod's shoulders. A low, smoldering fire below, usually fueled by damp wood, herbs, or moss, would send up smoke that dried and preserved the meat over hours or days. It was one of the few ways to keep food edible through winter, war, or travel. In coastal or forested regions, people added horizontal slats and wove racks between the legs, creating makeshift smokers or drying shelves. Fish, mushrooms, roots, everything that could spoil was given a second life with smoke and airflow. The tripod could be set up in minutes, taken down in seconds, and used again wherever it was needed. It didn't rust, it didn't warp, and if it broke, you made another. This simplicity was key in a medieval world where time and materials were always limited. You didn't need nails, metal, or tools beyond a hatchet and a bit of skill. You didn't need to be strong, just clever. And because it folded, it could travel with you, whether you were moving camp, following a herd, or just finding better shelter after a storm. Modern bushcrafters still use the wooden tripod for all the same reasons. It's efficient, sustainable, and endlessly adaptable. Add a hanging chain and you've got a modern twist. Swap out the wood for bamboo or birch and you can adapt to different environments. Want to go ultra primitive? Use twisted plant fiber or bark as rope. But the essence remains the same. Fire below, survival above. In every era, the tripod reminds us that the best tools aren't always bought. They're built. From scavenged limbs and scorched rope, medieval people created a kitchen, a smokehouse, and a survival system that still works today. Because when your shelter is the wild and your pantry is whatever you've caught, every stick counts. Clay pot refrigerator. Before ice boxes, before electricity, before cold storage was even a concept, there was ingenuity. Medieval people knew that preserving food wasn't about technology. It was about temperature, airflow, and time-tested tricks passed from one hungry winter to the next. That's how they built early refrigerators from clay and turned simple holes in the ground into life-saving pantries. The clay pot refrigerator, sometimes called a zier pot today, relied on one basic principle: evaporative cooling. Two clay pots, one next to the other, with the space between filled with damp sand. As water evaporated through the porous outer pot, it pulled heat away from the inner chamber, dropping the temperature inside. Place this in the shade, keep it wet, and you had a surprisingly cool container, enough to preserve milk, vegetables, even leftover stew for days longer than open air would allow. It sounds like magic, but it's simple physics. In medieval towns, these clay coolers were used in markets and homes alike. Farmers kept cheese or butter cool on warm days. Herbalists stored poultices and infusions. Fishmongers kept their catch fresh until it could be salted or cooked. You didn't need a river or snow, you just needed clay, water, and the wisdom to use both right. But when winter came, or when you needed to store things for the long haul, the strategy shifted underground. Root cellars and storage pits were as old as agriculture itself. Peasants dug them near the house or barn, lining the walls with straw, stone, or wood. These pits took advantage of the Earth's stable temperature, keeping food cool in summer and above freezing in winter. It was a natural refrigerator, powered by the planet itself. Inside, they stored root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots. Cabbage heads were wrapped in cloth. Apples were laid in layers of straw. Even smoked meats or grains were stored here, protected from rodents by sealed lids or lifted shelves. The key was moisture control. Too dry and food shriveled. Too damp and it rotted. So villagers learned to balance airflow and insulation, venting pits, layering materials, even placing charcoal to absorb odors. Some communities dug these pits beneath homes, keeping food literally beneath their feet. Others shared larger communal storage pits, checked daily during lean months. In either case, the message was clear: waste nothing, store everything, because you never knew when the next crop might fail. Today, as modern society faces rising energy costs and unstable systems, these ancient techniques are coming back. Off-grid homesteaders build clay pot fridges to preserve fresh food in desert climates. Survivalists dig root pits in forest shelters. And those looking to live closer to the land are finding that refrigeration doesn't have to plug into a wall. It just has to work. And in the quiet dark of a well-dug pit or the damp walls of a hand-shaped pot, medieval wisdom whispers again. The earth will keep your food if you know how to ask it. Bushcraft shelter pegs and binding techniques. Shelter wasn't a structure, it was a skill. In the medieval world, you couldn't always count on walls. Whether herding livestock, traveling between villages, or escaping war-torn regions, people needed to build with whatever the forest gave them. And with just a hatchet, rope, and a good eye for timber, they could. The secret? Pegs and bindings. Forget nails or metal fasteners. Most peasants couldn't afford them. Instead, they used sharpened wooden pegs, split branches, and twisted fibers to create strong, stable structures that could withstand rain, wind, and snow. It wasn't just bushcraft, it was architecture adapted to survival. It started with the frame. 3 or 4 thick limbs were cut from hardwood trees, oak, ash, or hazel, and driven into the ground. These formed the main posts. Crossbeams were lashed between them, secured with bindings made from twisted bark strips, nettle cordage, or even animal sinew. The joints were reinforced with wooden pegs, tapered by hand and hammered through pre-carved holes. This gave stability without relying on nails or glue. Then came the roof. Branches were woven between beams to form a lattice. Over that, layers of bark, leaves, or thatch were added for insulation and waterproofing. In colder seasons, mud or moss was packed into the gaps. A good builder knew how to angle the roof for runoff, how to raise the floor with logs, and how to vent smoke from a small internal fire. None of this required a single piece of iron. It was a system based entirely on knowledge, on how to split wood without cracking it, how to strip fibers for rope, how to find trees that bent instead of snapped. It was taught by example, passed down from parent to child, not written down, but remembered in hands and muscle memory. Some medieval hunting lodges and field shelters stood for seasons without repair. Others were dismantled and rebuilt as people moved with the seasons or game. The technique was flexible, scalable, and surprisingly strong, especially when time and weather didn't allow for more permanent structures. Today, bushcraft experts use the same methods to build off-grid shelters, emergency camps, or even full cabins. And whether it's a lean-to, an A-frame, or a thatched lodge, the principles are the same. Use the land, respect the material, and let knowledge do the work. Because in the wild, survival isn't about owning tools. It's about knowing how to make them count. Water purifier with charcoal and sand layers. In medieval life, water could be a blessing or a death sentence. Rivers brought life to crops and cattle, but they also carried waste, rot, and disease. Wells were safer, but not always accessible. And in times of war, famine, or drought, even clean water could vanish overnight. So how did people survive? With something deceptively simple: layered filtration using charcoal, sand, and cloth. This wasn't modern science. It was observation, trial and error, passed down wisdom that said, if you run water through the earth long enough, it comes out cleaner. And from that, peasants and monks alike learned to build rudimentary purifiers using the most basic materials: barrels, clay jars, woven baskets, and what nature gave them. The design was often vertical. A container, usually a wooden barrel or a large ceramic pot, was filled in layers. At the bottom, gravel or coarse stones to catch large debris. Then, a layer of fine sand packed tightly to remove cloudiness and trap smaller particles. On top of that, crushed charcoal, burned wood from cooking fires, ground to a coarse black powder. Charcoal was the secret weapon. It didn't just absorb color and odor, it captured bacteria, filtered out some toxins, and improved taste, especially in stagnant water pulled from puddles or cisterns. Above the charcoal, people often placed cloth or moss as a pre-filter, removing insects, leaves, or larger waste. The result? Water that was visibly cleaner, safer to drink, and less likely to cause illness in an age where disease could wipe out entire villages. It wasn't perfect. It didn't kill everything, but it reduced risk. And in a world where one bad drink could mean fever, dysentery, or death, that was everything. These filters were often placed near hearths or gardens, close to where water was drawn daily. They weren't built for pressure or speed, but for patience. Slow drip filters, some of which took hours to produce a single jug of water. But that slowness was the point. The longer the water spent in contact with charcoal and sand, the cleaner it became. Some versions went further. Monasteries and larger estates sometimes built permanent stone filtration systems, channeling rainwater through troughs lined with layers of sand and ash. In colder climates, snowmelt was filtered this way too, captured in basins, melted by sun or fire, and dripped through multi-layered jars before use. Today, these same principles are used in emergency filters, off-grid systems, and eco-villages around the world. The idea that charcoal and sand can purify water isn't medieval myth. It's modern survival science, born in a time when the only option was to make clean water yourself. With nothing but firewood, earth, and gravity, medieval people created a solution to one of the deadliest challenges of their time. And maybe that's the lesson. You don't always need chemicals, tech, or pumps. Sometimes, what keeps you alive has been under your feet the whole time, waiting for you to build it, layer by layer. Survival, at its core, is never about having more. It's about knowing more. These medieval tools weren't born from comfort or abundance. They were shaped by necessity, refined by repetition, and trusted because they worked when nothing else did. Each one tells a story of resilience, of people who faced cold nights, empty fields, and uncertain futures, and still found ways to adapt, endure, and build. What they left behind isn't just old technology, it's a blueprint, a quiet reminder that even in the harshest times, human hands and minds have always found a way forward, not through luxury, but through knowledge, patience, and the will to try.